Hello, brilliant minds. It's MattyAtoms, and we've been walking through the successful landings on the moon, the Lunar program through Apollo 17, every spacecraft that actually landed, every footprint that was left behind. But this story isn't complete without first talking about the missions that didn't make it. The ones that changed everything precisely because they failed. Today we're talking about Apollo 1 and Apollo 13, because before we ever set foot on the moon, 3 astronauts died tragically in a fire. And 2 years later, 3 more came within inches of dying in the vacuum of outer space. One tragedy made the other survivable. This story is about 3 men who died so that 3 other men could live. It's a story about failure, about learning, about resilience, and about how tragedy can force an entire program to get better. So let's just start at the beginning. Gus Grissom was a legend. He was a Mercury 7 astronaut, one of the original guys. 2 space flights under his belt already. Ed White was a test pilot and a brilliant engineer, the first American to ever walk in space. Roger Chaffee was the rookie, younger than the others, but he'd been training relentlessly for the moment. These guys weren't just some astronauts, they were the astronauts that you would want on this mission. 3 guys who dedicated their lives to getting America to the moon. On January 27th, 1967, they suited up for what should have been a routine test, a plugs-out integrated test, basically just a dress rehearsal. They'd sit in the capsule on top of the rocket, run through all of the systems, make sure that everything worked, no fuel in the rocket, no launch plan, just a test on the pad at Cape Kennedy. But the command module they climbed into that day was a Tinderbox, and nobody fully realized it yet. The Apollo command module was cutting edge. It was also packed with problems that nobody had thought through completely. The first problem, the cabin was pressurized with pure oxygen. 100% oxygen at 16.7 pounds per square inch. It's extremely flammable. A spark in that environment, it doesn't just catch fire, it explodes violently and it spreads fast. NASA knew oxygen was dangerous, but they thought that the sealed system would prevent the fire from happening, and they were wrong. The second problem was the internal wiring. Over 1,000 wire segments running through the capsule, many of them damaged or with worn insulation. Exposed copper, no protection, it's just waiting for a spark to come. And the third problem, well, that was the materials inside of the cabin. Velcro, netting, various other things that were highly combustible. In a pure oxygen environment, they became fuel. At 1:53 p.m., Grissom, White, and Chaffee entered the capsule and started running through their checklists. Systems check, everything nominal on the surface, but at 6:31 p.m., something sparked inside of that cabin. Nobody knows exactly what. Could have been the damaged wiring, it could have been something else, but in that pure oxygen environment at that pressure, it didn't matter. The spark became a fire, and the fire became a disaster. Everything happened within seconds. The pure oxygen fed flames instantly. The pressure inside the capsule skyrocketed as the fire consumed the materials around them. Grissom, White, and Chaffee tried to open the hatch, but it was designed to open inward, which meant the internal pressure was actually working against them, making it harder to open the door. They couldn't get it open. The heat was catastrophic. By the time the ground crews realized something was wrong and rushed to the launch pad, it was too late and all 3 men had perished. The investigation that followed was brutal. NASA had to figure out exactly what killed 3 of America's best astronauts in a test that was supposed to be completely safe. What they found was a cascade of failures. Not one big mistake, but dozens of small ones that added up to tragedy. Bad wiring, flammable materials, a hatch that couldn't open under pressure, and the decision to use pure oxygen in a pressurized cabin. NASA had cut corners. Not intentionally, but systematically. The pressure to beat the Russians to the moon, to meet Kennedy's deadline, to keep costs down, it all started adding up. North American Rockwell, which was the contractor who built the command module, they knew about some of these issues. Quality control slipped. Change orders existed and should have addressed the wiring problems, but in the rush, corners got cut. So, who officially got blamed? Well, NASA called it a systems failure. Behind the scenes, though, there was plenty of finger pointing, but there was no single scapegoat, and honestly, That's the more honest truth, because really, the whole system malfunctioned. The pressure to launch, the cost cutting, the overconfidence in untested designs, it was systemic, and that's actually what made the investigation valuable. Instead of just firing someone and moving on, NASA had to fix the entire system. After Apollo 1, they grounded the entire Apollo program for 21 months. They completely redesigned the command module from ground up. The new cabin used a nitrogen-oxygen mixture now instead of pure oxygen, which dramatically reduced the fire risk. Flammable materials were reduced with fire-resistant ones. The capsule was completely rewired with better insulation and protection. The hatch was redesigned so it could open quickly in an emergency. And they added better procedures, better training, better redundancy in every critical system. But NASA also learned something else. You can't just test on the pad. Between Apollo 2 and Apollo 10, they ran unmanned and crewed missions in Earth orbit. Apollo 7, 8, 9, 10, each one of them testing different systems, different procedures, pushing the boundaries a little bit more, but carefully each time. Some of these flights had problems, some had close calls, but that's why they existed, to find these problems before sending people to the moon. By the time Apollo 11 launched in 1969, the spacecraft had been tested, retested, and stress tested in ways that simply wouldn't have happened if the tragedy of Apollo 1 didn't first happen. 3 men died so that the next 3 could land on the moon. But more importantly, 3 men died so the other men could come home alive. And NASA's doing the exact same thing with Artemis right now. Careful testing, they're pushing boundaries slowly, making sure that every system works before we send people back to the moon. A lot of people are frustrated that the timeline keeps getting pushed back. But after Apollo 1, after learning that lesson the hard way, NASA learned to prioritize safety over speed. It's boring and it's expensive, but it keeps people alive. Which brings us to April 1970, 2 years after Apollo 11 landed on the moon. By then, the novelty had worn off. People stopped watching. Congress was already talking about cutting the space budget. Apollo 13 was supposed to be just a routine landing, just another moon landing, just another mission. The crew was solid. Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert. Professional, experienced. And according to my girlfriend after watching Apollo 13, one of them's a total hunk. She wasn't wrong about Kevin Bacon, I guess. But, seriously though, these were the best pilots that NASA had. And nothing special was planned, no drama expected, just another trip to the moon. Except, drama has a way of finding you when it wants to. So, 2 days into the mission, at 55,000 miles away from Earth, an oxygen tank in the service module ruptured, violently. It tore through the ship's systems. Suddenly, the crew wasn't making it to the moon anymore. They were fighting for their lives, and they had almost no time to figure out how to get home. What happened next was the most desperate improvisation in spaceflight history, and it only worked because of the lessons learned from Apollo 1. Jim Lovell was in the command module when he heard the bang, a violent explosion. Instruments started going wild. Oxygen levels were dropping, power systems started failing, and the service module, the part of the spacecraft that kept them alive, was crippled. They were 200,000 miles from home with a dead ship. The first thing Lovell did was radio mission control. Houston, we've had a problem. Those words became famous, but in that moment, nobody knew how serious it was. Nobody knew if they were coming home at all. What happened next was a race against time and physics. The command module was damaged and it was losing oxygen fast. They couldn't stay there, so NASA made a desperate decision. They abandoned the command module and used the Lunar module, the small spacecraft that's just designed to land 2 men on the moon. So they used this as a lifeboat to get 3 men home. It wasn't designed for this. The life support was only for 2 men for about 45 hours. They needed to keep 3 men alive for about 90 hours. The math wasn't mathin'. But this was their only shot, so they had to shut down almost everything to conserve power. Life support systems were running on minimal settings. The temperature dropped. They were floating through darkness with almost no heat, no light, just what they absolutely needed. And they had to navigate home manually. No computers working properly. They had to look out the windows, find Earth, and do the math by hand to aim the spacecraft back. Back of the napkin calculations to get home from 200,000 miles away. For 4 days, the 3 men huddled in the tiny cabin, rationing off everything, improvising solutions, following instructions from mission control who were doing the same kind of desperate problem solving back home on Earth. They had to rig a makeshift filter using materials from the command module to scrub out the carbon dioxide so that they didn't suffocate. They had to conserve every drop of water, every amp of power, everything. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. On April 17th, 1970, Apollo 13 splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. 3 men who should have died came home alive. It was called a successful failure, disaster averted, and it only happened because of what NASA learned from Apollo 1, the redundancy in systems, the obsessive attention to procedure, the culture of safety that had been beaten into every engineer and astronaut after those 3 men died on the launch pad. Think about it. If Apollo 1 never happened, if NASA hadn't been forced to completely redesign the command module, to add redundancy, to build in backup systems for backup systems, to get rid of the pure oxygen, Apollo 13 would have just been a coffin drifting in space. 3 more dead astronauts, but instead, because of the lessons learned in tragedy, those 3 men came home. And that's the connection, and that's why Apollo 1 matters. That's why we talk about it, and that's why those men didn't pass away in vain. Because out of that fire came a program that was safer, smarter, and more human. It proved that failure, if you're willing to learn from it, can save lives. And 3 men died so that 3 more could live. In a way, that's the best tribute that we can give them. I hope you all learned something today. Take care, and make sure to watch the other 2 videos about Apollo 11 through 17. Peace.